So before we dive into creating the half-filled color layer, for anyone that's less familiar with VEX, I just want to introduce some kind of basic principles, explain how a for loop works, what a variable is, just so that when we start using these further on in the videos, you'll kind of be up to speed. So if you're already comfortable with using VEX, you can kind of skip this video if you want to, or stick around if you want to just have a basic understanding of what we're doing. So first of all, what is a variable? Well, a variable is simply something we can create temporarily to store some information in. We can give a variable a name, specify what type of information we want to store in that variable, and then the value that we want to assign to it. So here I am creating 3 different types of variables. The variables are called I, F, and V. The first one I'm creating is the integer variable, so the type is integer, so that's why I'm specifying before here int for int, and then I'm storing on this variable a value of 1. And an integer is a whole number, so it has no decimal place, unlike a float, which can have a decimal place. So here I'm creating a variable called f, it's of type float, and I'm storing here on it a value of 1.0. And then finally, I'm creating a vector variable. I'm calling the vector v, and then I'm storing on here a vector. And a vector is an array of 2 or more values. So here I have a vector that contains 3 float values that could represent a position in 3D space, a normal direction, a color. I'm storing this vector on a variable called v. Once you have that information stored on these variables, we can then kind of do things with them. So I'm going to type @cd, which is for the color attribute, and I'm running here on points. So if I come now over to the geometry spreadsheet, you can see here I've created a color attribute just by typing @cd, and I can type equals v, our vector variable. And now you can see my cube has turned green. And that's because I've got here a value of 1 in the second channel, which is the green channel, so RGB. So that's taken this variable and passed it to our color attribute, and we now have it applied to our points. And we could also do other things with variables as well. So if I type here v equals v times f, and then end with a semicolon, I'm now multiplying the vector we created by the float variable. So if I increase this from 1 to 2, we can see our cube gets brighter as I multiply it now by 2. I can multiply it by 3, and it gets even brighter still. So these variables become very useful. We can create some information, store it on a variable, and then begin to manipulate these variables before passing them to, in this case, an attribute and viewing it in the viewport. And variables are temporary. They are created and used whilst the VEX is being executed, and then discarded once it's finished. So that's kind of a very brief overview of what variables are and how you can use them. Let's move on to looking at a for loop. So here I've kind of created a dummy for loop just to explain the basic principles of the for loop. A for loop is structured like so. It has 3 different statements. The first statement is executed right at the start of the for loop. So it's executed once right at the start when the for loop begins. We then have statement 2, and this defines the condition for the for loop to run. While statement 2 is true, the for loop will run. As soon as this statement is no longer true, the for loop will stop. So this is when you kind of define the condition for which you want the for loop to run. And then we have statement 3, and this executes right at the end of each loop. So the loop will run. The first time, statement 1 will be carried out. You'll check to whether or not statement 2 is met. If it is, it will run the loop, and then it will run statement 3. Then the loop will run again, check whether or not statement 2 is still true. If it is, it will run the code in the loop and then run statement 3 again. And so on. And it will keep going until statement 2 is no longer true and it returns false. So that's the basic principles. Let's just look at this example 2. And here I've replaced those statements with some kind of actual usable information. So right at the start here, statement 1, as I said before, runs right at the start of the loop. And here I'm creating an integer variable called I and storing on that variable value of 1. So right at the start, I'm defining a variable called I and saying it has a value of 1. Then the loop will check statement 2 and decide whether or not is this statement being met, is this statement true. If it is, then the loop will run. And this statement is I less than 5? Well, right at the start of the loop, it's got a value of 1. That is less than 5, so the loop will run. The code here is executed, and then at the end of the loop, statement 3 is ran. And here I have stated I++. And this is kind of the equivalent of saying I is equal to I plus 1. So right at the end of the loop, I is increased by a value of 1. So when the loop runs again, I has been incremented to a value of 2. I is still less than 5, so the loop is executed. I is incremented to 3. Again, this is still less than 5, so the loop will run, and so on until I is eventually reached a value of 5, or 5 is no longer, so that means I is no longer less than 5, and the loop stops. So that's the basic principle of a for loop, and the basic logic that we'll be using inside of the height field color layer node will be created. If you're still a little fuzzy on the details, don't worry. We're going through the loop step by step, but at least now you kind of have a basic idea of what's happening.